Well, folks, we're going to talk about some pretty, if not lighthearted stuff today, then some fantastical stuff today for the most part. But I do want to open up this episode by, noting, and I mean, it would be remiss to not acknowledge the ongoing war against the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, really the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people that is being carried out by the Israeli state at the behest of the U.S. government, using U.S. government technology, U.S. government hardware, U.S. government intelligence, and U.S. government diplomatic cover. Right now, they are cracking down on the Palestinian people who absolutely have the right to resist, will continue to resist, and will one day be free because that's their land. They deserve to have that. I know if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't need to be convinced of that. But if the off chance that you're not educated on this issue, it's important that you get educated. And no matter what, it is important that you get in the streets, you get involved, you get active on this. Most of our listeners, not all, but most are Americans. And so I would just like to let you know tomorrow, this is coming out on Friday, the 3rd. Tomorrow, if you're listening to a day of, the 4th, there is going to be a massive demonstration for Palestine in Freedom Plaza. That's in Washington, D.C., in front of the White House. It is going to be, we don't know the exact numbers yet, but it is going to be the largest demonstration in U.S. history for Palestine. And we need as many people there as possible. So please, if you're anywhere in the area, get there. If you're not in the area, that's okay. Find a demonstration in your region. If there's not a demonstration in your region, there probably is, but if there's not, make one. Talk to your coworkers, talk to your family, educate people and yourself about this. We have to keep this going. There is going to be on the ground sustained momentum on this. We cannot let up. As we are in the belly of the beast. We are in the core of imperialism. We have the responsibility to stand against it. Now, this march that's happening on the 4th is being sponsored by a lot of organizations. The organization we both work with, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, is playing a major organizing role. There's Palestinian Youth Movement and a variety, Answer Coalition, and a variety of other really principled, fantastic organizations. So get plugged in with one of these organizations and, make your mark on history right now. We cannot stand silent while this genocide is being carried out. As the Ballad of Black Tom, the book we're going to talk about, aptly points out, often the horrors inflicted by man, the like racist, imperialist, genocidal horrors inflicted by humanity, by the capitalist structures on people are more horrifying than any monster that could be dreamed up by just a fantasy writer. And it is our responsibility to stand against these monsters. Don't let the Palestinian people be another person or another group that gets land acknowledgments. Don't in 100 years us all say, well, why did no one do anything? We have to do something now. So I apologize for a really bleak opening here, but I think it needs to be said. Joss, do you have anything to add, or should we cut to the music?
Well, Vonnegut said that, all the anti-war demonstrations in American history amounted to basically a custard pie dropped off a 6-foot ladder or whatever he said. And respectfully, Mr. Vonnegut did not grow up in a reality where you could see a genocide happening live. And you
Mm-hmm.
can see this happening live. The plight of the Palestinians is worldwide like never before. The state of Israel's propaganda is being debunked in real time as fast as they can rush out their vile, vile blood libel. And there is going to be a qualitative change. The scales are falling from people's eyes as never before, certainly in my lifetime. And I saw a tweet just today that as that happens, as Palestinians fight for their freedom, they may very well end up freeing us in the process. Welcome, once again, to the Socialist Shelf. Now, I will preface this with a quick dedication. My sister, if you're listening, thank you once again for the 2 books, one of which we will be talking about today, that were on my mind just this past week. One of which was The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow by Kij Johnson. The other one is today's offering, The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. Yes, Lovecraft is on our minds once again, in all his contradictions, in all his good, in all his bad, his very, very bad. And again, as Jacob pointed out earlier on, anti-colonialism, decolonization, liberation is on our minds at this moment. And liberation, the point at which fighting for your life becomes fighting back is, I think, very deftly dealt with in this volume. Jacob, what do you think?
I think Victor LaValle says it as well as any of us could say it going into this episode, which is in much the same way as we said in our Lovecraft episode. He dedicated this book to Lovecraft, quote, with all my conflicted feelings. And in the same way that we have, there are massively conflicted feelings about Lovecraft, as you said, and but this book, I think, in a really interesting way. I say book, more of a novella, not too long, but this story synthesizes Lovecraft in a very interesting way, and it synthesizes a lot of the horror dealt with by the most marginalized in our society. And it takes the sort of lens of horror that Lovecraft uses typically to not have a broader point. Not to say that Lovecraft doesn't often make broader points about society through his horror, such as the horror of Red Hook, which he certainly does. But often Lovecraft's point is just, wow, wouldn't it be fucked up if X? That is just kind of a thing he likes to do. Not that he's not coming with his own presuppositions, but Victor LaValle is able to sort of harness that Lovecraftian energy and point it in a direction that speaks to, societal horrors, that refocuses it, and that gives it more humanity than Lovecraft is usually able to accomplish in his works, and certainly more than Lovecraft accomplishes in the horror at Red Hook, which we should probably open up by talking about, because the Ballad of Black Tom is a retelling of Lovecraft's short story, The Horror at Red Hook, which was written in 1925 over a period of 2 days in early August.
Yeah, it shows.
Yeah, look, you heard us, well, maybe you didn't, but if you did, we talked about Lovecraft extensively on our episode about the Mountains of Madness. We praised that book for the most part. We had a lot of criticism of Lovecraft for obvious reasons. We will not rehash all of that in this episode because we don't want to be redundant, but I'll just kind of lay out our line on him. He's an interesting guy, an interesting product of the time of the insecurities of modernity rushing in, and this guy who is comes from this family that is well off but has lost their money, and he feels alienated and isolated, and he turns to reaction and racism to cope with that, and it's inexcusable the way he behaves, even, and not just inexcusable in the way that the era was broadly racist, inexcusable as in racist for the era. He does not get a pass.
Yeah.
He gets no passes.
I have a book lying around of his letters to a contemporary and not protege, but the next generation, C.L. Moore. The letters that he wrote to her, there is a sense, a sort of I don't want to say rumor, but many people say that, oh well, he moderated toward the end of his life, and I want to be clear, not by a whole hell of a lot. Even into 1936, the year before he died, he was writing back and forth with his contemporaries about skull shapes and shit. It is honestly jaw-dropping, the shit that this guy was up to.
And but despite all that, there is a lot to be said for his work. It is incredibly clever. It is incredibly we talk about it, but his word choice is remarkable. What the words he chooses, the level of precision he has, the way he's able to convey concepts broadly without specificity and make you feel the missing places, the way he is able to, people say jazz is about the notes you don't play, and a lot of things Lovecraft is about the horrors you don't show. He is able to introduce that, and a lot of authors have done really interesting things with what we call Lovecraftian mythos, and he has introduced a lot of really interesting things into the world, and he introduced a lot of really interesting concepts of this cosmic horror, which is why a lot of his books are still pretty good and interesting. The Horror at Red Hook is not particularly good, and it's not particularly interesting. Even Lovecraft himself was okay, this one wasn't that good. I actually just kind of banged this one out. He himself admitted that in his lifetime.
Yeah, credit where it's due. Lovecraft knew when he was unwarrantedly self-critical at certain points, but he certainly knew that he was not capable of producing something truly great if he didn't really enjoy it, if it didn't really speak to him. And this did not really speak to him. He was writing horror at Red Hook at a time when he was trying to break into more conventional pulp magazines outside of his usual like Weird Tales cosmic horror niche, and then Weird Tales was the only magazine that picked up this story. So, he's like, okay, yeah, I hacked this one out and it shows.
Yeah, and essentially the overall plot is there is a police officer, a detective named Detective Malone, who is describing his time during an incident at Red Hook, Brooklyn. Red Hook being a sort of community, largely immigrant community within New York City, within Brooklyn, and that he is now recovering from it, and he had a terrible, horrible time. He backtracks to where it began, and it's basically his story of dealing with this strange case of this guy named Robert. How do you say his last name? It's Suydam. It's a Dutch name. Is it Sudam? Suydam?
I think it's Sidem.
Sidem. We'll say Sidem. And if we're wrong,
All of our
I don't
Dutch
think.
listeners can take us to task.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Robert Sidem is this, rich guy, but a sort of declining rich noble family who takes up the dark arts, gets very interested in them. Thomas Malone, the cop, who is also just something of a mystic. He actually, Lovecraft ascribes his mysticism to him being a Celtic guy, being from Dublin, because Lovecraft is that specifically racist.
Oh yes, and this is really an interesting sort of turning point in Lovecraft's work and also in American history, right? Because
Right.
you get the point where Irishmen, there's still very much prejudice against Irishmen. There are still there are
I mean, he
still
makes an Irish guy a policeman in this. It's a
well,
stereotype
exactly,
right off the
right.
bat.
At a point where there are still restrictive covenants, like, oh, like no Irishmen or black men like need, rent from here or like seek employment here. There is this incorporation into whiteness of this particular population that there is still, institutional prejudice against.
Mm-hmm. And essentially, Robert Slodum is this. I describe him as a poor old rich guy. Basically, he's like half insane. His family tries to take his money, which is why the detective Malone is put on the case. They're not able to prove that he's insane. He ends up starting to get like all kinds of arcane abilities and stuff. He's getting, more well off. He's getting younger looking, and he's keeping a lot of what Lovecraft describes as foul company, like immigrants, like Arab immigrants and that sort of thing. Lovecraft is very racist about all this. There is an immigration conspiracy, a supposed kidnapping of blue-eyed Norwegian children that it talks about. And then basically when the detective Malone tries to investigate and tries to intervene, Robert has died, and he goes underneath this horrifying apartment building that Robert has bought out in Red Hook in this neighborhood, and sees all the horrors of hell, and sees babies getting eaten and dancing dudes and all kinds of scary shit. And then he's like, oh my god, this is terrifying. And then he like gets out and it collapses, and the end is he's like, no one believes me, but I'm like so scared. That's
If
kind of what happens.
if Next Door was a short story, it would be the horror at Red Hook.
Yeah.
And this comparison comes to my mind because at the time of writing this, Lovecraft was A, living in Red Hook, and B, deep in poverty, right? So he had that resentment that he turned outward at, the people around him. And it's before a lot of his stronger work, and indeed, it's not really connected to it except in very like you got to squint to see certain commonalities. It's not one of his mythos works. They are not worshiping Cthulhu, at least not in the horror Red Hook. They are in Ballad of Black Tom.
Yeah.
But no, it's just your bog standard, scary immigrants doing devil worship stuff.
Yeah.
It's the sort it antedates the sort of satanic panic nonsense that you would have seen in the 1980s, which was less about the Satanism than it was about a reaction by right wingers, the religious right, to this perception that they were losing cultural primacy.
Yeah, and I have two like important quotes that I want to read from this story that I think kind of gives you the gist of it, because there are really two theses here. The first one is just the plain kind of racist immigrant terror idea of a scary community of people who quote aren't supposed to be here, end quote. And he even refers to them as illegal immigrants and contrasts them to the good immigrants that came through Ellis Island, and he was like, they came the good way. These guys came the bad way. You know, that the reactionaries don't come up with new stuff. They do the same thing, which, spoiler alert, coming the good way means coming from Europe. It means it now and it meant it then. That's what they mean when they say that. But let me read a quote of describing the neighborhood in the area. And I'll skip some bits here because it's a long passage, but I just want to read this bit. Quote, the population is a hopeless tangle and enigma. Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements impinging upon one another, and fragments of Scandinavian and American belts lying not far distant. It is a babel of sound and filth, and sends out strange cries to answer the lapping of oily waves at its grimy piers, and the monstrous organ litanies of the harbor whistles. Here long ago a brighter picture dwelt, with clear-eyed mariners on the lower streets and homes of taste and substance from where the larger houses line the hill. From this tangle of material and spiritual putrescence, the blasphemies of 100 dialects assail the sky. Hordes of prowlers reel, shouting and singing along the lanes and thoroughfares. Occasional furtive hands suddenly extinguish lights and pull down curtains, and swarthy, sin-pitted faces disappear from windows when visitors pick their way through. Policemen despair of order or reform and seek rather to erect barriers protecting the outside world from the contagion. End quote. It's bad. It's really racist.
Officer, my neighbors are playing their music too loud.
Like, yeah, literally, it's like it's like people are speaking different languages and they
He
turn off
literally
their lights
he says
sometimes.
just a little further on, visible offenses are as varied as the local dialects.
Yeah. Super cool, Lovecraft. I
Oh.
mean, like it's, I don't have to I don't
This
have to argue why that's racist. It's very racist on its face. And
yeah.
Lovecraft would tell you, "Oh yeah, I'm being racist here." He would not have he was not hiding that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, and this is I think this is in direct contrast, and this is of course um this is in direct contrast to some of the descriptions of the city that we get in the Ballad of Black Tom. Um do we want to start off with Victor LaValle right quick before we dive in?
Well, actually I have one more quote I want to read.
Yeah.
Um
Uh-huh.
really quick. Because that was the first point of the story that I think needs to be noted. And then there's a second point to the horror red hook that I think needs to be noted. And that is the concept of if smart people, in Lovecraft's view, white people, could synthesize the hidden religions of the what he considered primitive people, they could come up with some horrifying stuff. And the quote goes, quote, high intelligence jeers at the inmost mysteries, for, he argued, if superior minds were ever placed in fullest contacts with the secrets preserved by ancient and lowly cults, the resultant abnormalities would soon not only wreck the world, but threaten the very integrity of the universe, end quote. So he's making the argument, and this is recurring in some of his other stories, including Call of Cthulhu, that basically like what he considers to be primitive people, people who are studying like voodoo and people who come from like African traditions and Middle Eastern traditions and all numbers of different stuff, and he kind of lumps it all in together because again he's racist. They are onto something, but they don't understand it in full. And if scientifically minded people understood what they were talking and working with, then it could like bring about the world's end. He does not make room for the idea that these people might understand the religions that they have, like that the idea that they don't fully understand their own religions. He does not interrogate the fact that like why would the smart people not have figured out the true religions? Why, like it's a contradictory idea of like the quote unwashed masses wield both great power and are incredibly stupid. Like they're able to be all powerful and and ignorant at the same time, because that's just how reactionaries think. That's the type of double think that is necessary to like maintain such racist ideology. But it is important to note that that theory and the idea that a guy like I'm sorry, a guy like Robert Sodom is able to harness the power he is simply because he's a white guy harnessing these like other traditions powers. So that's important to know going into the Ballad of Black Tom.
And it's a contradiction that Victor LaValle turns very neatly on its head over the course of the story.
Yes. Yes. And speaking of Victor LaValle, he is the author we're focusing on today, not H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's got his episode and he may have more, but you know, that context is important. But Victor LaValle is an American author born in 1972 in Queens. So he is from the New York area. His mother is from Uganda, Ugandan immigrant, and she was, you know, single mother. He said he had a very, you know, chaotic childhood growing up. A lot of people coming in, staying for a little while at his house, not being there. He said it was very loving, but very chaotic, is what he comes back to when he talks about his childhood. He was a big reader. He was a very curious child, always trying to read, you know, fiction and stuff. And he said 4 foundational authors: Clive Barker, Stephen King, Shirley Jackson, and above them all, H.P. Lovecraft. He said it took him a while to admit to himself how bad Lovecraft's racism was, because as a young guy, when he first read Lovecraft 10, 11, 12, he did not want to admit that Lovecraft was that kind of guy. He wanted to love and respect Lovecraft. And he said that he would return to his works later, 14, 15, 16 years old. And he was like, okay, I have to admit, this guy would not treat me with respect if he knew me. English was the thing he loved. And so he went and studied English at Cornell University. He had really bad mental health problems and physical problems in college. He gained a lot of weight. He had struggled with depression and anxiety. Bipolar disorder and schizophrenia runs in his family. He says he felt like he got some combination of that and was like kind of afraid to ever be institutionalized and checked out to figure out what he does actually have. It caused him to drop out of Cornell. However, he eventually returned, managed to get his degree in English, and then got a master's in creative writing at Columbia University, and now teaches at Columbia University and has ever since teaches writing.
Columbia University, famous alma mater, at least briefly, of J.D. Salinger.
Yep. In 1999, he published a short story collection called Slapboxing with Jesus, 11 short stories of young Black and Latino boys. Very well received critically, and shortly after this, he lost a lot of weight. He said not for himself, but for the like the picture on the cover jacket. He said he felt very vain about that. He did not want people to be like, oh, that's that fat author. His words, not mine. And he said so he got vain and lost a lot of weight for vanity, not for his own health. He says he doesn't particularly care much about that. That is very funny.
That is some motivated fucking vanity. I tell you what, I aspire to that level.
In 2002, he wrote The Ecstatic, about an obese schizophrenic college dropout. You know, so a lot of his own, you know, experience in there. The family that tries to help the boy in that story is as messed up in the head as he is. It's all gallows humor kind of stuff. Bit of a break, and then in 2009, he writes Big Machine, a book about a suicide cult. So he's getting more into the stuff that will be Ballad of Black Tom. And in 2012, in the same vein, he writes The Devil in Silver, about a man who is completely sane, who gets mistakenly institutionalized at a mental hospital and basically finds out the place is haunted, but no one believes the patients because they're clinically insane. And he's the only one who knows it's a real haunting because he has no problems. Though he does start to go insane by the way he is treated there. So there's like, you know, also social commentary. 2016, he writes Ballad of Black Tom, which has been his most successful work. And we will be talking about today. Won all kinds of, you know, awards and stuff, you know, World Science Fiction Convention awards and Shirley Jackson Award, Hugo Award, Nebula, Fantasy, Bram Stoker Award. It did very well. Some of those were nominations, but he did quite well. I really like that he, you know, has won and been nominated separate times for the Shirley Jackson Award, as she's one of his like favorite authors. She was foundational for him, so that's super cool. He also wrote The Changeling, another novel, and the graphic novel Destroyer, about a descendant of Dr. Frankenstein. Um, he, in his continuing writing to today, he's got some other stuff as well. I believe he wrote a book called Up from Slavery. There's a variety. He helped work on A People's Future of the United States,
Yes,
which
yes, I
he
was just thinking about
collaborated
that.
with Omar El-Akkad,
Mm.
which is interesting. Not directly, but they both have entries in A People's Future of the United States, which is pretty interesting. So there's some tie in there.
Which again, Omar El-Akkad, Riverbed, the story that appears in that highly, highly recommend.
Very good. You can listen to our interview with Omar El-Akkad if you scroll up your feed. Because we're name droppers at heart. Um, yeah.
Well,
Quite a few.
Robert Sidham is also a name dropper, so that can lead you to some pretty powerful circles.
Yeah, just don't drop the name in the wrong context. But won all kinds of stuff. He's in the Guggenheim Fellowship, which he shares with the author of Gideon the Ninth.
Tamsin Muir.
Yes. Fine Arts Work Center Fiction Fellow, Breadloaf Writings Fellow. He's, United States Artist Ford Fellowship. He's done quite well for himself, and he's contributed to all number of publications and different stuff. Some great interviews. He's an interesting guy. He's not a super public guy. Like, there's not a ton on him. And he's also a guy that, like, he's not very old. He's 51. It strikes me that his, like, what it might be considered his greatest works very well may be ahead of him. Because he is picking up with every work he's done. He has had like more critical and commercial success. So, an artist to watch there, even though he's been in the business for a few decades now. So cool guy. And a guy who is very interested in things like concepts of mental health, but how they intersect with, society itself, how mental health and, perceived insanity and the idea of being an outcast, how all of those things that like work very well with Lovecraft intersect with like actual social things that Lovecraft was never tangling with. And so he took the horror Red Hook and wrote the Ballad of Black Tom, which absolute blast of a novella.
Well, and
Really
there's an overlap. I'm glad you bring up mental health, right? Because the concept of masking, right,
Yeah.
is shot through this entire book, specifically from the racial perspective. I mean, from our protagonist, Charles Thomas Tester, Tommy Tester, is very, very conscious of how he has to present as a black man in even a city as diverse as New York,
Yeah.
right? It's always got to be, yes, sir, I play guitar. No, sir, I got a couple more stops on the train still,
Yeah, having a destination he has to cite, answering
Yes.
questions, that kind of thing.
Constantly deferential, as unremarkable, as invisible, as compliant as possible in order to avoid arousing the suspicion and indeed the wrath of white America. This is something that's constantly weighing on him. And indeed, it's for as terrifying existentially as that is, you still see from the beginning a certain beauty that Lovecraft is completely blind to. I'll read from page 13 here. Let's see. Nope, I'm sorry. Page 11. In the clothes he'd picked, I should say Charles Thomas Tester. Tommy Tester is a musician. He plays guitar. He sings a few songs.
He's not a particularly good musician.
Yeah,
notably.
no, he picks on the guitar. He sings a few songs badly, but he hustles and he makes enough money to support himself and his father.
Yeah.
In the clothes he'd picked, he sure looked the part of the dazzling down and out musician. He was a man who drew notice and enjoyed it. He walked to the train station as if he were on his way to play a rent party alongside Willie the Lion Smith. And Tommy had played with Willie's band once. After a single song, Willie threw Tommy out. And yet Tommy toted that guitar case like the businessmen proudly carrying their briefcases off to work now. The streets of Harlem had gone haywire in 1924, with blacks arriving from the South and the West Indies. A crowded part of the city found itself with more folks to accommodate. Tommy Tester enjoyed all this just fine. Walking through Harlem first thing in the morning was like being a single drop of blood inside an enormous body that was waking up. Brick and mortar, elevated train tracks, and miles of underground pipe, This city lived day and night. It thrived. There is a vitality here that sets itself very, very starkly against Lovecraft's rot and
Yeah.
decay, because all the beauty that Lovecraft alludes to is in the past, right? And you skipped over this in your first extract from Red Hook, but he says, "Oh yeah, the architecture, like, it used to be pretty and the sounds used to be great, and then all the scary foreigners moved in." No, even with all the terror that he has to navigate, there is beauty in this city. There are rent parties. There are times where people can come together, help each other get through the day, and just forget about their troubles, even if for only a moment.
And even in the hustle and bustle of it all, like he feels like he's red blood pumping through it. It
Yes.
describes itself in a very specific way. I feel like Lovecraft describing the same situation, it would have been like, I was a bug on a microscope in a society. And he's like, no, I'm blood pumping through the arteries of this city, like a city that he does want to be a part of, a society that does reject him, but he is like very willing and happy as a guy just to be, someone who's a part of. He wishes he could be even more integrated into society, as we'll get into. Also, I would be remiss to not mention, because it just came across my screen, that apparently Victor LaValle has a TV show on Apple TV starring Lakeith Stanfield coming out soon. So
Yo,
shout out
okay.
to him for that. Lakeith Stanfield of Sorry to Bother You, Atlanta, Get Out fame. So pretty cool. Um,
I believe he also played L in the American Death Note.
Maybe I have not seen that. Um, look, notably, I would love I think a film adaptation of Ballad of Black Tom could be pretty dope.
There
Um,
was an adaptation in the works.
was there?
Well, it was one of those many, many things that was announced pre-COVID, so who the fuck knows at this stage?
Right, right. And I mean, we could have a whole conversation about the difficulty of Lovecraft style adaptations to film, but that's not what this is about. This is about the Ballad of Black Tom. Yeah, so character, our main character, Charles Thomas Tester, like you were saying, he goes by Tommy Tester, and I mean, he kind of, I think, oversells to himself what like a hustler he is. He's like, I'm hustling people. I'm making them think that I'm a jazz man. When in reality, well, he's still a jazz man. He's still playing music. He's still like he's just not like particularly good at it. It
Hmm.
is it's a funny hustle, because it's like he's not I mean, like, and he's clearly like, it doesn't go into it. He's clearly like involved in some other stuff. Like at the beginning of the novel, he's bringing a book that's like clearly like sort of sub legal across the city and stuff. So he's like kind of got his fingers in different things. But the reason, notably, that he is not directly involved in like working just a quote unquote honest trade like his father had is his father makes the point. His father, Otis, who lives with him, his father is a widower, by the way. He looks and moves like an old man, but his father's only 41 years old because he's been broken down by construction. His father worked in cement. And it says, again and again, very like clearly that like, despite that his father is like, yeah, I could get you a job working where I used to work. And he's like, Dad, you got paid less than the white laborers. You weren't allowed to be part of a union. So if your boss just took your money or mistreated you, there was nothing that could be done. If work didn't get done, you were made to stay late to do it. They broke you down. And on the day that you couldn't come to work, they replaced you and never thought about you again. He says, I can't do that. I will not do that to myself. Tommy is 20 years old. He's, vital. It's in the prime of his life. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hustle first. Yeah, of course, like if you're looking at that calculation, you're looking at your father broken down, old man at 41. It's like, and you have any opportunity to escape that, then like naturally you're going to do that.
Oh yeah.
Um, and it's interesting, and he kind of views his father as a saint, which like he views his father as this like perfect example of like what a man should be, and in an ideal world everyone would be his father. And his father does now and again kind of throw some like wrenches into that, like where his father mentions, oh yeah, no, I used to carry around this like straight razor all the time, and I had to use it sometimes to defend myself, especially when I was going through like Alabama and Georgia and stuff. So he's able to
Oh
be like,
yeah.
oh, my father did have a history, my father did do what I had to do, had to hustle to get where he was today. So he does have that tradition. His father is like a full person, but at the end of the day, his father is like an ideal member of that society. And what happens to him? He gets broken down and, spoiler alert, gets fucking murked by the police. Not even by the police, by private police. And then like that are like deputized to kill by the
Yes.
NYPD
It
in
is
his
it is
own damn home.
it is funny to me that not that obviously, but it's funny to me that the private police detective in this story is named Howard.
Mm,
As in, I mean, H.P. Lovecraft, right? Howard
right.
Phillips Lovecraft. Of course, it's not supposed to be a direct allusion to Howard, to the person himself. Lovecraft is mentioned in the story as a character. Blink and you'll miss him.
Wait,
But
okay. I blinked and I missed him, so you'll have to.
oh yeah, so it's there. It's very late in the book, right? But after the whole, of course, this story takes place concurrently with the horror at Red Hook, right?
Yes.
Chronologically, the horror at Red Hook begins somewhere halfway through the Ballad of Black Tom, and after all the events of that story end, there is mention of the fallout, of the cleanup of the neighborhood, and it mentions that there's a guy who is very, very persistent about like knowing what happened, and like he was living here with his wife, and then eventually he moved back to Providence for his health.
Oh, yeah, I do remember that. Okay.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
that's him. But I do think there is something to the fact that the private detective is named Howard, because it's that shadow, right? It's that shadow of whiteness that is over, not only you as a black man in this world, but also, Lovecraft himself over his mythos, because as enduring as his mythos is by the nature of how he made it, you still have to grapple with what spawned it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
So like the very beginning of the book is Tommy Tester taking this book, this like magic book, basically to a woman named Ma'at. Is that how you would say it to you?
Ma
Ma'at?
Ma'at, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a basically a anglicization, like bastardization of, as we find out, an Egyptian word, an Egyptian concept, Ma'at.
Yes.
All of our Egyptian listeners, like if I butchered that, sorry. All of our
Yes.
ancient Egyptian listeners,
You know,
Ma'at
of which there
is
are many,
oh
hopefully, but
yes,
um
yes, down
and
there
and
on
interestingly enough, it's a book that contains it's a book that contains like an ancient alphabet. And if I'm correct, it's the supreme alphabet of the 5% nation, actually.
yes.
Which I'm not like super educated on, but my understanding is the 5% nation also refers itself to as to the nation of gods and earths, is
Mhm.
like a black nationalist, like Islam influence movement.
Yeah, sort of
But
like a Nation of Islam, like adjacent, just in terms
yeah,
of
more mystic. It's like kind of
yes.
more mystic adjacent. It talks about like basically their idea is 10% of the earth are elites, 85% of the earth are sheep, and 5% of the earth are struggling against the 10% to bring the 85% into the light. It's like
Yes. But
the
here,
the
well,
the
well, and
alphabet comes from the like 5% nation
well, and
tradition.
you're I think you're very correct in pointing out this thing that we recognize from the beginning. That Tommy recognizes from the beginning, that the old lady, that Ma'at does or doesn't necessarily like. So I mean, first off, right, the issue with horror at Red Hook, one of the many issues with horror at Red Hook, as we alluded to, is that, well, it takes a wealthy eccentric Dutchman, right, to parse through all this stuff from like the dark corners of the earth and whatnot. But here in the Supreme Alphabet, along comes something that, it transpires, is known and is understood to Tommy and to his father, right?
Yeah.
Something that they can peer into, that ultimately Robert Sidum misses.
Yes. Um, But yeah, notably the 5% nation, though, of course, it does not play like a super big role in this, aside from their supreme alphabet, which notably
Right.
the supreme alphabet is what, yeah, they know about, the others miss, but it is a alphabet that contains just 10, I think it's 10, like 10 symbols, and that I wrote them down. They represent knowledge, wisdom, understanding, culture slash freedom, power slash refinement,
Mhm.
equality, God, build slash destroy, birth, and then just zero, which is the cipher,
Yes.
the symbol. And there's a lot more like stuff that comes with that, and probably like a lot of things that I've missed because I don't know a lot about that history. But it is interesting that that is like the power that at first, Tommy's like carrying around, and he kind of knows what it is, but he's like not fooling with it because he's smart enough not to. And eventually, this will be the power that he's able to harness.
Well, and
He's kind of like,
indeed,
it's not my business at first. It's
well,
funny.
and and indeed, right? It transpires that he delivers this book of some sorcerous power that he knows not to mess with, right? He delivers it to Ma'at, and it's not whole, right?
Yeah, intentionally.
The last page has been removed, not by him, by his father. His father, it transpires, is illiterate,
Hmm.
which is interesting to me.
Which
Tommy
is how
knows.
he's able to remove
Yes.
the page without being affected, which is
I mean,
interesting.
I love that, like it's a common joke, it's a common trope in Lovecraft, like as long as you're illiterate, you're fine. As long as you don't read the books, you're fine. If you've read Knights of the Dinner Table or any other comedy like dealing with Lovecraft and Cthulhu, like
Yeah.
illiteracy is the cheat code here.
Yeah, snow and like it's kind of similar to like Snow Crash. If you're not a programmer, you can't read the ones and zeros. Snow Crash isn't going to do shit to you because
I
you
mean,
can't.
yeah.
You're not observing the bitmap.
I mean,
But
Lovecraft himself said, the most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents.
yeah. So basically, Tommy then shortly later comes across Robert Sudham. And Robert's like, you should play at my party. Jazz man. And he's like, sure thing. And he's like, I'll pay you a lot of money to do it. Um, and sure enough, as soon as Robert leaves, two detectives, one being Malone, the main character of the original story, The Horror at Red Hook, and then that other guy, Howard, the private detective, come along. They rough him up. They take his money. They treat him poorly. They threaten him. They're just generally racist towards him. And they're like, you better not come back here. But he's like, this guy is offering me so much money. I'm going to have to come back here. But it also introduces, Malone in a different way because in Horror at Red Hook, Malone is very much this guy who's like, I'm kind of a thoughtful police officer, whatever. And like, indeed, he's not the guy who is the main brute in the interaction between the officers and Tommy, but nevertheless, he's standing there. He's allowing it to happen. He's reinforcing it. He's like maybe playing the good cop slightly compared to this like private deputy, but like nevertheless, he is like part of the system. And it doesn't matter if he sees himself as the good cop or if he has like sensibilities, or indeed if he's like at home taking his little notes and doing his little doodles and he has an interior life. When he puts on the badge and he spends time in the streets, he is reinforcing the system that is crushing, everyone around him.
Yes. And it's a more thorough and interesting interrogation of, because Lovecraft has that contradiction in his original story, that Malone used to be a poet, right? So he was kind of too sensitive for the cop job. He was too like,
yeah,
he had this sort of incisiveness about him, this inquisitiveness that cops don't necessarily possess, right?
right.
And what LaValle is doing here is taking that a step farther, right? He's saying, look, there's, as an Irishman against whom institutional prejudice does still exist, Malone has been on Tommy's side of this before in a way, like not as severely, but in a different way. Malone knows when Tommy is hustling, right? Malone knows when Tommy is code switching and trying to hide something, But, Tommy sees this, or I'll read from the last bit of chapter 2 here. Malone walked off and Tommy Tester remained there, feeling exposed, seen, in a way he'd never experienced, because Malone just asked him, okay, look, what's the real story? You can be straight with me, right? You're a cop, Tommy called. Can't you protect me? Malone looked back once more. Guns and badges don't scare everyone. That's the thing. There's different laws for different classes of people, and if you're from an underclass and you put on a cop's uniform, well, it's not really about the uniform. The uniform is just there to scare people. Once you're marginalized, and yet on the inside of that power structure, you're exposed to a deeper level of brutality than the mere aesthetic will let on.
And I'll note later in the novella when Tommy has people around him who are support like an institution. I mean, it's like an organized crime kind of thing, but he has guys with him. He now has power. He now has whatever he says, and he gets threatened by Malone. He says, "Guns and badges don't scare everyone."
I love that.
he's just like, like now I've got mine. So
before we
yeah,
get
no,
too
go
much
ahead.
further, like Ma'at, what did you think of her? Like, because initially.
Nothing at the beginning, and then a little later, she is like implied to be a sorceress of some kind, possibly having a gigantic tail.
It was interesting to me because like she asks Tommy about, like, because Tommy hangs out in the Victoria Club, right?
Yeah.
Which is specifically for like people from the West Indies hang out there a lot,
Yeah.
and like Ma'at has a question about it, like, oh, like there's all kinds of like ruffians there, like crazy shit goes down there. It's a hive of scum and villainy. Tell me more about that. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, is she some kind of poser who like genuinely doesn't know what she stumbled across? But I mean, she is aware of the sorceress potential of the book, which is why she cottons onto it immediately that the last page is missing.
Right. And she, later on, Malone talks to her and he's able to like sort of, he rolls like perception and is able to send something that the dumb cop isn't. And
Mm.
that she's got like some power behind her. And he's like, did she have a giant tail or whatever? It doesn't reveal. It's actually a moment that feels very Lovecraftian and like
Oh
something
yeah.
Lovecraft would write,
Hmm.
especially the not really revealing it. She has some kind of magic, something going on. It's not important to the plot, but it is interesting and it makes the world feel lived in, as in there are these characters who are walking around with this like dark knowledge.
Hmm.
Um, and they're holding it and they're interacting and they're bouncing. And she kind of exists to be like, they're like, hey, there's this magician. Now look what Tommy can do now that he has some of his power, but we'll get to that.
Oh
And she kind of
yes.
is like the villain who's introduced to introduce the more powerful villain who like just smacks the villain from season one down. I mean, I'm not to say Tommy's necessarily a villain, but it's like that kind of energy, like
I'm a
kind of like
sucker for that kind of dynamic.
it's yeah, it's like my favorite example. This show is ass, but season three of Arrow, Ra's al Ghul showing up and dropping the season one villain and of Merlin in two hits. Like
Mm.
it's kind of sick. Like I don't know why I thought of Arrow right now,
Season three
but
of Ruby, where like like Ruby reveals that she has the silver eyes and blows Cinder away, and Cinder's last
mhm,
words are like, "What?"
yeah, it's sick. But nevertheless. Um, Tommy goes home. He spends some time with his father. They go to that club that we were referring to. Not a whole lot necessarily happens there except for that conversation we mentioned where he realizes his father is a little bit more of a complicated man than he knows. He gives him
Hmm.
that straight razor and he's like, carry this with you. He's like, you're going to that white man's house. You're going to his fancy party. You want to have this razor with you.
I really want to. I would love to just to sit down with Victor LaValle and discuss how he puts this together, because there's a lot of specificity
Yeah.
in what Otis is saying here. Like, I avoided
Yeah.
crossing Arkansas. Otis continued. Whether you were Negro, white, or a red man, they were pretty rough and hoboing in Arkansas. They had chain gangs. Like that's. I mean, it's terrifying corners of history that are very easy to sort of walk past if you don't grow up in that history.
Okay, so Tommy eventually. Oh, and lastly, Tommy interacts with his friend who's not particularly important, but it's notable. Buckeye. Buckeye is this guy who like works at the club, and he's from Montserrat, I believe. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah,
Um,
Montserrat.
and he worked on the Panama Canal. And he's like, yeah, when I
Mm.
worked on the Panama Canal, there were like dudes there who were like talking about Cthulhu. It's like that's like kind of a notable thing is like that there's like these like stories that are going around in these cultures. These people that are like being really exploited for their labor actually do know like the dark secrets that are like lying beneath the earth.
I
Um,
wish people talked about that shit at my job.
yeah, much more interesting. Um, and then like, what did you do this weekend? He's like, yeah, what did you do this weekend? And the Dark King will soon awaken.
Oh yeah, like I like, oh, I had a dream about like the fucking Sleeping King, like drowning the world, in
Mhm. And so notably, every single time I read Sleeping King, I read Stephen King and this. Every single because it's SK and they're both capital. It just every single time I read, it's just like my brain does that. I don't know why. But
Stephen
anyway,
King just like wakes up and like
yeah. And he's just there. Yeah, exactly. So when Stephen King awakens, you watch out. So Tommy goes to Sodom's house. I cannot say that name for the life of me. Sodom. Am I saying that right?
Sidem. Sidem.
Sidom. Sidom.
It's like the like sexy shark from fucking Zelda, but with an M instead of an N.
So true. Sidon. Sidom's house. He goes there. He gets
I knew that would
racially,
work.
yeah, he gets true. He gets racially profiled on the train going there, gets harassed. Sidom's house seemed scary at first, but then he gets like Tommy gets chased into there by these like this racist gang of youths, basically. Um, And
they're like 15 too, which is like, I mean, maybe they're like a really tall, maybe they like filled out pretty early, right?
yeah, and there's like
For like
several of
youths.
them. And also like
But that's
it's
the thing,
also
like,
worth noting if Tommy fights back, then he's the one who's going to get in trouble.
yes, and that's the thing, like you can totally see how that existential fear could, children can punch well above their weight if they are situated in that hierarchy.
Yeah, and like 3 15-year-olds, and then you're not allowed to punch them. They could do real damage to you. Um, but in Sitem's house, which is this broken down ass, old manor, very, very much like a great horror set. And the only place in the house that's not broken down is this over the top lavish library that's full of arcane knowledge. And Sitem speaks about, at length gives the speech that he's going to give tomorrow at the party to Tommy. He's basically brought Tommy here early to like be his test audience. And he's like, we are going to interact with the sleeping king. And he's talking about Cthulhu here. They don't use the name Cthulhu until later in the book, but
If you've seen Lovecraft Country, like the first episode of this, like really, really evokes this pretty well.
yeah. Um, and he's there and he's like kind of trying to manipulate Tommy because he clearly Sidem thinks he's a lot smarter than Tommy. He's like, look what they've done to your people. Don't you want to wash them away? And he's like, don't you want to destroy society? He goes, think about it. Think about how when the sleeping king rises, when Stephen King rises, um, all of all of society will be washed away except those who helped him wake, and then we will have the power. We will be whatever. And he's pitching that, and of course he has this moment where he goes, quote, capital outside. And he's like looking out the window, and it's a very, traditional Lovecraftian horror moment of like seeing space and seeing the sea and seeing the fucked up architecture of the Cthulhu town. And he's like terrified to walk out the door. And even when he opens the door slightly, he sees the face of Malone and like through fucking space time. And it's like all over the place, and it messes with his brain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's like, and Tommy's like, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole, I'm not messing with this. He takes his pay and he's like, says, oh yeah, I'll be back tomorrow. No intention to go back tomorrow. But when he gets back to Harlem, two things happen. The first is him having that money. He gets treated really, really well. He gets treated, he says, like a prince. When people see as that stack of money, he gets waited on quickly. He's able to leave a huge tip, which feels very good for him. And he's like, shoot, if this is what Cthulhu will bring, then like I'm all down with that. And then the more notable and more important thing, he gets back to his apartment. Malone and Howard, the two cops, are there, and they have going through his things, trying to like follow up a lead on him. Ended up murdering his father, Otis.
Yes.
And they said, I thought he had a rifle. His father was holding a guitar, and he shot him, I think, 11 times or something. It was like absurd.
They
murdered him in cold blood.
And they just tell it to him straight, like totally. It is wrenching reading this, right?
It's horrifying. And it's out of nowhere too, because he's feeling kind of nice, coming back from the diner, and then boom.
Oh yeah. Like and notably, it's Howard immediately he sees that this person whose father he has just murdered is in shock, unable to say anything. And then he turns to Malone and he's like, see, I told you, these people don't have like familial connections like you and I understand. He is in shock, you motherfucker.
Yeah. It's insane. And then I really want to read the quote from this part because it's very important. Tester is talking now to Howard, the cop who killed his father. He says, how many times did you shoot my father? Tester asked. I felt in danger for my life, Mr. Howard said. I emptied my revolver. Then I reloaded it and did it again. Tester's tongue felt too large for his mouth, and for the first time he thought he might cry or cry out. He felt the weight of the stone in his coat pocket, heavier now, as if dragging him to the ground. His night with Robert Sidem returned to him, all of it all at once. The breathless terror with which the old man spoke of the sleeping king. A fear of cosmic indifference suddenly seemed comical or downright naive. Tester looked back to Malone and Mr. Howard. Beyond them, he saw the police forces at the barricades as they muscled the crowd of Negroes back. He saw the decaying facade of his tenement with new eyes. He saw the patrol cars parked in the middle of the road, like three great black hounds waiting to pounce on all these gathered sheep. What was indifference compared to malice? Indifference would be such a relief, Tommy said. And I think if there's anything that like, you know, if there's any passage to take from this, it's this. It's
Oh yeah.
Tommy being like, why should I be scared of fucking Cthulhu, of this thing that is indifferent, this force of nature, when there is this active malice, these people who are actively out to kill me and systemically empowered to do so, and they
Yes.
do not get to be indifferent. Like they do not get to have the excuse of I am just a different species, or I see you like they are making the choice every day. They are suiting up and coming up to New York from Texas on a job in Mr. Howard's case, and not even being a police officer in the city, being deputized on a, as a private detective, and killing a guy holding a guitar, and knowing what that means, and understanding what that means, and being able to not just live with themselves, but to just throw it out casually to the person's child, and just be all fat and happy with it.
The
It's
sheer
unbelievable.
impunity with which they take a life, while Tommy has to avoid certain neighborhoods and
Mm-hmm.
avoid and say yes sir and no sir, for fear of being, beaten down by white children.
Yes.
It's if you don't look at this and you're horrified, right? I don't know,
And it's worth noting, this story's set in 1925, but this shit happens every day, and it has
yes,
happened every day for more than 100 years now.
Ahmaud Arbery, like
Yeah.
you can be jogging through a neighborhood, right?
And so
And
many names we don't know, too,
yeah, yeah,
so many names and so many names of like, yeah, how do you think the police did this one, right? Because like it says later in the book that like he never got his father's body back because they like just did some
I was
clerical
thinking about
error.
that. I think
It's like how many
because
people never get the bodies back? There's a
yeah,
case right now that it just happened in, I believe, Alabama, actually, of like a woman who like lost her son and like months later found out he had been in the police station morgue, and they're like, oh, we don't know what happened to him or
oh
whatever.
yeah,
And she
yeah,
had to pay
standard.
$200 to get her son's body that had been run over by a fucking cop, and they hadn't even had the decency to tell her. This
Yeah,
happened in 2023, and this shit is happening every day, and it's been happening since then, and it's been happening before then. And it is scarier than fucking Cthulhu.
yeah, standard fucking operating procedure of Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The hold the body and not let you.
Mm.
It is vile. It is and it's that kind of everyday. I mean, this book is my favorite use of, there's that trope that white people don't know not to go in the haunted house, right? And this book really, really peels back the why of that, because you know you haven't had to deal with an uncaring, all-encompassing force that is
Mm.
dangerous and even hostile, right? When it notices you, if you're black and working class in America, yeah, you have.
Yeah,
Like, and
it reminds me of when Breonna Greer was murdered in Sparta, Georgia. I was there a few days afterwards at a protest, a sort of impromptu protest. Um, and one of the sheriffs pulled by, and the Sparta, Georgia Sheriff Department had killed 3 people in the past year. Um, and in a town of like 1,500 people too. So think about that proportional to the population of the town. How many people know someone killed by the police? And somebody was saying like, Breonna Greer, she was called, like they called 911 for like she was having a medical emergency, and the sheriff just kind of said, "What did you think was going to happen when you called us?" And he drove away. Like just callously, whatever. Like that's what happens. That's what we do. And this was in 2022, y'all. This is not. Yeah. Anyway.
and
Dark.
to
Yeah. God.
to
Yeah.
to yeah, and to drive the point home and to take it back to the text, it's not. Tommy opens the door during this like ritual, right? That Sidam shows him at the party, right?
Yeah. That
Um,
happens shortly after this because he doesn't give a shit anymore. Yeah.
it's not the sleeping king that Tommy sees when he opens the door. Not as Robert expects.
Hmm.
It's Malone. That is
Yeah.
the existential threat to Tommy.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Sundown Town still exists, y'all.
Yeah. And notably, um, And yeah, notably that scene, and it happened shortly afterwards because he has no reason not to go back to the side of him. He's like, fuck it. And yeah, he has that experience. He opens that door
Hmm.
that's to the outside that's not supposed to be opened. He steps through the door. And we don't know exactly what happens to Tommy in between that moment and when we see him again, but he becomes Black Tom. He becomes the lieutenant of Sidem. He becomes this incredibly powerful sort of sorcerer slash mafia boss. Um, and he's basically able to have a moment where he reckons with that horror,
Hmm.
um and is able to then these deeper secrets of Cthulhu and all that, he's able to like harness that power. He's able to have it, he's able to understand it, he's able to work with it. The existential dread that's like being experienced by other people in that movement, like Sidem, who is always speaking with great fear and trembling of Cthulhu, you don't see any of that out of Tommy. He is not afraid of that. He has already seen shit way scarier than he can ever conceive. And is able to harness it. But at that point in the novel, it switches perspectives to Malone, the
Yes.
protagonist of Horror at Red Hook. And I
Yes.
wrote
This
down
is this is where chronologically horror at Red Hook begins.
and it's talking about how he's like, yeah, I'm walking the streets and I'm, taking in the sights and I'm having these like sort of supernatural visions. And I was like, holy shit, Disco Elysium. Yeah, Harry Dubois. No, very different, but there is like, if you've played Disco Elysium, the perspective of Malone is very similar to the Shivers mechanic in Disco Elysium. If you put points into Shivers and you have sort of experiences with the sort of supernatural and things touching the supernatural, and they don't usually help you very much. They just kind of
Hmm.
give you this like vague experience. That's kind of what Malone's experiencing, and he's like obsessed with that. And he like sees himself as not like the other cops because he's more he understands these other people more, partially because of his like Irish background, partially because he's like a tender soul or whatever.
Yeah, Malone's not
Um,
like other girls.
yeah, and even notably, for a while, the people in like his beat actually treat him more like, okay, yeah, we're not gonna like be weird because this guy's not weird with us. Now, the
Hmm.
second that he like kind of breaks that fragile truce with them, they break it back. Um,
Hmm.
but he I thought it was a notable detail that the people actually did give him like a modicum of respect for his respect towards them, and that it was reciprocated. And he was like, "What the hell, guys? Thought we were friends." And it was like, but he's and so it gives this interesting perspective. And like, I want to note again that like, while he is this kind of sensitive guy, he's also wearing the gun and the badge. And as this book is very well aware, that makes him the symbol of the state in a way that can't be escaped. And he is responsible for, he has this blood on his hands. Whether he feels it as acute, he maybe feels it more acutely than say Howard does or whatever. He maybe is a little more curious. He is maybe sees these people as a little more human. But if he sees these people as more human and he does the shit anyway, then that doesn't make him a better person.
I want
He's
to
actually overcoming his impulses more.
I want to draw attention to the pacing of the book as well.
Yeah.
Now that we've entered the Malone bit, it's so it's not a very long book. It's like a
No.
hundred and it's like a
121
hundred.
pages for me.
Yeah, yeah. So, but we have time over the first 10 chapters to sort of dwell in the city, right? To follow Tommy Tester throughout his day, right? And throughout his, happiness, throughout his deep, deep sorrow. And then chapter 11, flip up a couple pages, we're at the end. Chapter 12, flip one page, we're at the end. Chapter 13, it is bits and pieces, it is snatches of Malone's perspective that we are treated to fleeting glimpses of. You get the
Hmm.
sense that things have sped up beyond his ability to fully perceive.
Oh yeah. And it's because like weird shit's going on. And he's now on the beat of trying to figure out about this immigration ring. This idea of like, how are all these immigrants getting into the country? And so he's on the Red Hook beat, Red Hook being this immigrant neighborhood that Lovecraft described so grotesquely. And Malone has, the perspective Malone gives is a little more nuanced, but he's basically still saying it as, this like crime-ridden neighborhood or whatever. And Sidem basically has taken up residence in this neighborhood after making friends with a lot of people in the community. He's bought up several apartment blocks and has kind of converted them into his base of operations. He has a small army around him, and his lieutenant is a guy named Black Tom, who is, of course, Tommy Tester. And he walks around with a bloody guitar and he's humming, and he can like hum a note that will like fucking like will fuck you up. Like he hums a note and it like drops people.
He
It's
does that thing
really
where,
cool.
he sings a show tune and then, races it like up or down a half step at the end.
Yes, exactly. But in this case, it drops you.
I
Yeah.
dreamed a dream in time gone by.
Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah, that's exactly what happens in this novel. Imagine. Um, yeah, so basically he has so Malone, encounters Black Tom in the streets and basically, gets manhandled without even Black Tom throwing a punch, without Tommy throwing a punch.
And this is so cathartic. This is
Yeah,
so
because
cathartic.
it's a similar experience as what he had to go through.
Yes. It's Tommy can stand up to him now and fear absolutely nothing because he's tapped into serious shit.
Yeah. And then Tommy rolls up to Ma'at's house where she has this like magic alphabet that he's going to need for his ritual. And we don't know everything that goes on. We just know he literally hums a note that rips her house like from this plane of reality.
Just
leaving nothing but plumbing.
Just takes the eraser tool and just like
yeah, and I actually love the description that it doesn't take everything; it rips everything but the plumbing, and it's left like a skeleton of like the veins of the house are left behind. And so we don't know much about her aside from she was like magic, and now he's like really magic. The thing we were talking about earlier of like the villain of season 3 dropping the villain of season 1 easily. It's that kind of thing. And so Malone gets freaked out and says, "Oh, well, we're going to have to launch this operation to take down, Sidem and Black Tom and their whole operation," and makes up this whole thing about this ring of this crime ring.
And again, there's this moment here in chapter 15 where he's talking to the racist white lady who's like, yeah, I saw a black man walk into that house, and I have kids, I wanted to be safe, and like. It shows you just the power of like the crocodile tears of the white woman at this point in history, right? And still today, like it's because she says at first, well, like my girl started crying in the kitchen and I couldn't stop watching. I was so curious, and the lie by omission that she's telling is, oh, my kid was so scared, and then right at the end of the chapter, she's like, oh yeah, my kid cried herself to sleep right there on the kitchen floor. She'd been trying to reach the jar of peppermints, right? Know, and. It's the sort of blank that gets filled in by an institutionally racist police force who's
absolutely
whose goal is to maintain the state of apartheid.
Yes. And so then we launch into basically the climax. The NYPD is out in full force. A rumor has been spread, we're not sure who by, probably the NYPD, that some Norwegian children have been kidnapped.
This is critical. Yes, that is it.
Yes, and that's notable.
Because that's the thing, like, first of all, again, we have that thing of where, like, there's a poem called Providence in 2000 AD that I mentioned way back in the At the Mountains of Madness episode, right? Where Lovecraft is like, yeah, I'm racist against, like, a lot of people, like Scandinavians in particular, right? But in Horror Red Hook, right, Lovecraft says, well, like three Norwegian children went missing, and like the stout Vikings of Brooklyn were like getting together or whatever for an angry mob. So like that's the point where a people that Lovecraft is nominally prejudiced against can get incorporated into whiteness to use against this other even lower people, right? And Lovecraft plays the disappearance of the children completely straight. Here, as you say, there is a rumor that kids have gone missing. It's like that episode of Buffy, right, where there's the demon that pretends to be the kids who were murdered, and there's a big panic in town, but nobody even knows their names, just that there are children missing, potentially. That's what this is. It is the specter of, it's 40 beheaded babies, right? It's a specter, it's blood libel, to get white people's blood up.
Yes, absolutely. And it's sufficient because they're able to build an army of the NYPD. And notably, he's like, yeah, we always carry revolvers, but we got these things too. And it's like fucking military grade rifles and artillery and shit.
Anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah. which like is funny, but also like be part of a major protest movement, and you'll see. Oh no, they do have that shit.
Oh yeah.
They rolled out the tanks in 2020 in Atlanta. I'll tell you that. But they roll it out in front of this apartment block and start going through apartment by apartment, getting ready to crack down. Um, and due to his special, special sight, his shivers, his disco, he's put those points into Shivers and Disco Elysium. Malone is able to see a hidden door, this door that's like hidden through, once again, past perception check. And the door is, there was like a magic that was hiding it, but he's able to see it. He goes down the stairs into this dark basement. Now, at this point in Horror of the Red Hook, story, he like sees hell. It's different in this. In this, he sees these in blood, basically his old partner Howard, the like really vicious kind of brute of a private cop, rent-a-cop that murdered Tommy's father. His
It's
blood has been used to like make these like runes out of this like alphabet, out of the
yeah.
5% Nation's supreme alphabet.
It
I'm
is
sorry, what
it,
were you gonna say?
it it is really just bothering me. It's sticking in my mind, right? That again, it's one of Lovecraft's early stories in terms of it because he did most of his best work in the last decade of his life. If you read Horror at Red Hook, like he spends a couple of pages on the specificity of, there are these demons running about and they are saying, these chants, and like he goes like from beginning to end this ritual with a specificity that he refrains from in later stories.
Yeah,
To his credit, like he does
yeah, it gets
evolve on that
better.
front. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's the sort of thing like you're spelling it out and it's just rendered that much goofier, right?
Mhm.
Especially apparently like there's this one like Latin chant apparently I mean, he wrote this thing in 2 days, right? And this one Latin
Mhm.
chant that appears is I think some invocation for like treasure hunting rather than like
Yeah.
summoning demons.
Yeah. It's notable. Like, there's a joke my pastor used to tell when the church I went to as a kid, where he would say, he'd be worked up and he said, God is all loving, God is all powerful, God is beautiful, God is compassionate. I wish I could describe him to you. And it's a pretty good joke. It's like it's true because he's indescribable, but it's a pretty good joke that you spend
Mhm.
2 paragraphs describing something and then saying, I wish I could describe it. It's, credit where credit's due. It's a pretty decent gag. Um, and as well as making a point, though, it's still indescribable despite everything I said. He wasn't just joking, but in this case, yeah, Lovecraft had not quite learned that lesson yet. Of if you're going to
Mhm.
call something indescribable, don't spend so much time describing it.
Yes.
Um, in this, though, it will come to find that vision, that weak part of the Red Hook, is basically a way that a way Malone has filled in his mind with what actually happened. He basically created a vision of hell to replace the actual experience of going down to this basement, seeing this like bloody alphabet, and seeing Tommy and Sidem with the corpse of Howard. And Sidem is like, we're about to awaken the king or whatever. It's this is it. This is the moment. And then you've got Tommy, who is got his own ideas, and he's like, no, Sidem's not running the show either. And he cuts Sidem's throat. He drops him. Um,
Yes.
After doing this kind of bit where he pretends to like mess up the ritual, even though he knows damn well what he's doing.
Mhm.
He drops Sidem. He's like, no, you're not running the show. Because Sidem, earlier noted, like he said, we'll rule the world and I will be your gracious emperor. Like Sidem still intends to be at the top of this order. Um, and Tommy has this like moment where he's like, what order would that be? He's still skeptical through his like rage. And so now the power is in his hands, the power to summon Cthulhu. And you have this moment that's like really horrifying where he uses the magic and the power and you're seeing the fucking lost city where Cthulhu sleeps and seeing the sleeping giant's head. And you have this moment, and I'll just describe it really quickly. And this portal is open and Malone is like being held by Tommy, and it says, Quote, Black Tom grunted. Suddenly he was doing something to Malone's face, but Malone couldn't understand what it could be. As Malone's hand rose, a new sensation crippled him. He'd been set on fire, so it felt. A burning pain whose cause he couldn't locate. He only knew it was agony, so bright the world seemed to flare around him. He howled as animals do, and the hand holding the pistol shot out against his will. The pistol fell from Malone's hand and flew through the portal into that distant sea. Malone screamed and let go of Black Tom's arm. He batted at his own face as if he might swat away his torment. Black Tom grunted again, and Malone's eyes became wet. Something was being done to Malone's eyes, a tugging sensation as if Malone's face was being yanked off. Black Tom held a straight razor in one hand, and it was slathered in blood. Black Tom had cut off Malone's eyelids. Try to shut them now, Black Tom said. You can't choose blindness when it suits you. Not anymore.
I fucking love that. That is metal as fuck.
Yeah.
And again, he uses his father's straight razor to do that. It's not just a tool of self-defense. He is permanently scarring,
Yes.
a representative of this white power structure.
Yeah, guy has nothing left. And,
Yeah,
and he says you can't choose blindness anymore because we know, like, Malone does know what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, as you noted earlier, Joss. And he chose blindness and he fucking can't anymore.
Exactly. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah. And sorry, if you make that choice, if you fuck with a subject people, that subject people will fuck back.
Yeah, and it literally, you have this moment where Malone cannot close his eyes and meets eyes with Cthulhu, and Cthulhu's eyes fucking open. And then at this moment, the building is falling overhead as the artillery does, and a bunch of NYPD officers come down the stairs, and they have their guns out, and it seems like, Tom is going to go down. And it doesn't say what happened right there. It takes a second for him to be remembering. But basically what happens is, and they're not sure how, Tommy does some cool trick and drops all the officers and then says, I'll take Cthulhu over you devils any day, and then vanishes, and the building collapses on them. And Cthulhu's awake. And it takes, and then it goes to, it goes and talks about Malone. He's in retirement now, and he has to wear special goggles, and he makes up a story, a couple layers of fake stories, one fake story of, I'm traumatized because X, and then another layer, the fake story that is told in the horror Red Hook of, I saw hell and demons, but he knows underneath it all, and he occasionally sees it. He sees it literally in the sky, the face of Tommy saying, I'll take Cthulhu over you devils any day, and he knows we
and he has a public breakdown, which is where the horror Red Hook starts.
Yes.
Not many weeks ago, on a street corner in the village of Pasquag, Rhode Island, a tall, heavily built, and wholesome-looking pedestrian furnished much speculation by a singular lapse of behavior. This lapse of behavior, of course, being, collapsing in the street and screaming.
Yes. And it's remarkable. And it's also remarkable that the fake story of the horror of Red Hook literally has to be him creating this image so he doesn't have to reckon with the fact that a black man was able to defeat New York's finest, basically. There's some element of that, and there's obviously the element of the horror he experienced, but it's also notable the choice Tommy made, and the last chapters reckon with this before Tommy has his sort of mysterious ending where he disappears never to be seen again, but where Tommy says to his friend straight up, no, I've ended their society. It might take a few months. It might take a century. I don't know how long it takes for these horrors to awake and for them to rise. Their time is not our time, but the seas will rise and devour the earth. And no, their society is done. It's doomed. Tommy Tester have ended this shit. And it's notable, and of course it has that element of when will Cthulhu rise from the seas? And you can make your whatever, but it's interesting that he's made that call, and then he vanishes never to be seen again. But he made the call to end the world, basically. It reminds me, I'm only thinking of this now, but in our V for Vendetta episode, we have this part where we said V represents the outcast of the world saying, I've judged the earth guilty. You have 2 years to make up for your sins. This is a very similar situation, and Tommy passed fucking judgment.
From page 130. I bear a hell within me, Black Tom growled, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. You're a monster, then, Malone said. I was made one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And if it ever gets a film adaptation, that's going to be like a badass scene too. Just, it's so cinematic, and there's like the portal with fucking Cthulhu, and it goes hard, and it's obviously metal as hell. And I actually meant to mention this earlier, but Victor LaValle is apparently gets a lot of inspiration from metal music. He says when he writes
Oh, fuck
writes,
yeah.
he says he feels like a lot of metal and hip hop are about deals with the devil and Faustian deals, whether they know it or not. He says,
Mm.
I gave up a lot. It's interesting. He makes the point. He says so much of hip hop and so much of metal are, I gave up so much to get this, went through hell to get money, or I went through hell to get my career, or I have been through so much, but now I can convert it into art, this pain into art. And he says that's fundamentally a Faustian deal. So
Yeah.
a lot of this is inspired by hip hop and metal, and it's a metal ass scene. Like it is you know, I'll take Cthulhu over you devils any day. Guitar riff, walking into the portal, like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's cool, but it's also like obviously fundamentally horrifying and sad because it is a guy who has decided to end humanity, and it is about the contradictions of a imperialist society destroying it. And you can take that literally in many ways. He says the seas will rise. I mean, in some extent there is just the straight up contradictions of like climate change destroying humanity. I'm not calling this a climate
Mm-hmm.
change metaphor. I'm just saying you can see that there is the idea of like oppressed people rising up and fighting back. There is the oppression of the police that have so long been on all kinds of communities coming back home, and that violence, resurging. There is the horrible things that we now experience in our society because there was no other way to contain the contradictions. It is the contradictions coming home, looking you in the face and saying, I'm here, and now you have to reckon with me. And you
Mm-hmm.
cannot be blind to it. Your eyes lids will be ripped off if you do not look at it and reckon with it and say, where do we go from here?
There is a wonderful passage earlier in the first quarter or so of The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, right, about the Haitian Revolution, where, James is very frank with the some of the reprisals, some of the violence done by the slaves freeing themselves,
Right.
against their former masters and whatnot. And he says, look, this happened and this happened and this happened, and yet they were moderate, compared to the daily, compared to the quotidian violence that, served only to keep these people in, immiseration and subjugation. This spate of this spate of violence, this spate of vengeance served to end that dynamic, and then it was over. And I mean, the my favorite footnote in any book comes from that, and yet they were moderate. James says, this statement has been criticized. I stand by it.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. As we stand by everything ever said on the socialist shelf, by the way.
Yes.
Probably not, but
yes, including that certain cities in Iowa aren't real.
Formal apology to whatever that city was called.
Sorry,
I'm sure they'll. Yeah. Well, this in the Ballad of Black Tom ends in a very ballad way of the protagonist leaping from to his apparent death, but then they look out and he's gone, and and you can almost hear, it doesn't say it, but you can almost hear the narrator saying, and some say he still walks the streets. It's that kind of ending.
And there's that element of he's still kind of singing the blues at the end, right? He says, look, I wish I'd been more like my father, right? He didn't give up his soul. I wonder if I could ever get mine back.
Yeah. And yeah, he wishes he could be more like his father, but unfortunately his father was killed. Unfortunately, that path was denied to him. He was made a monster. Like,
yes.
He was forced into this, and he tried every other path.
Yep.
And
it ends,
Zig
Zag Zig. That's we've gone this whole time without Zig Zag Zig. That's the last bit of the supreme alphabet that he uses to complete the spell.
You could be stressed in your life, but don't worry, because Cthulhu is coming pretty soon anyway. I mean, it's been about a century. There's no way that the sea's rising. No, I'm kidding, of course, but it's worth noting that these contradictions do destroy society. these contradictions are, the chickens do come home to roost, as Malcolm X said. And they will continue to, and like really remarkable, sometimes it's scary, sometimes, and unfortunately like necessary ways.
Yes.
But also, you know, you we can choose not to close our eyes. We can choose not to be the guys who have our eyelids chopped off and are forced to see. We don't have to. There's the biblical idea of like every knee will bow, some will be forced to bow. Like I would say that this feels very much like this. Every eye will see, some will have their eyelids chopped off. Addendum on the Book of Revelation there, I suppose. That's not supposed to be allowed. So apologies for the blasphemy, but in keeping with Lovecraftian tradition, it's very much like that. So ultimately, are you gonna be a Malone or are you gonna be a Tommy? Like, or are you gonna be some, like, who are you with? Because which side are you on? Because there are sides you have to take. You can be Malone and you can be a socially conscious, infograph posting tool of the state. Like, Malone might post like, his infographics and vote for Joe Biden, but at the end of the day, he's still a fucking cop. And he's still calling the masses of the people down, or the masses of the police down, to like repress poor communities. Or you can take this other side, whatever that ends up, looking like, however that manifests. And, this is a fun play on Lovecraft and criticism of Lovecraft, and also celebration of Lovecraft, the good parts of Lovecraft. It is a fun and cutting social commentary. And, I didn't realize until I read it what a perfect novella for our current time, as in, like, by current time, I mean November 2nd, 2023, how perfect it really is. And yeah, hell of a recommendation on this one, Joss. Hats off to you on this one. Well recommended.
Again, I wouldn't have read it were it not for my sister giving me this book as a gift. She is a much bigger reader than I am. She is much more active in the sci-fi sort of fantasy space than I am.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this goes out to her.
All right. Well, I think I've said my piece and more. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this thing up?
Current events. Decolonization is messy. The end of apartheid is messy. The end of slavery is messy. And, Marx summed it up pretty well. There is something in human history like retribution, and it is a rule of historical retribution that its instrument be forged, not by the offended, but by the offender himself.
So, folks, just remember, don't you mind people grinning in your face. Don't you mind people grinning in your face. I said, bear this in mind. A true friend is hard to find. Also said by Karl Marx. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Peace out.